Hello again. So far this week, we've looked at some heroes from Hebrews Hall of Fame. We've looked at Noah, a man who listened to God and did what he said. We've also looked at Joseph, a man who kept trusting God even in difficult times. Tonight, we're going to look at another hero of faith. But before we do that, I need your help tonight. I want you to help me write up a job description for a very important job. Let me tell you what the job is. I need someone to go and visit the Queen, and I need them to speak to her and tell her to do something. Now, the Queen's really important and pretty powerful, so we need to think very carefully about who might get this job and what skills they might need to have to do the job well. So let's have a think. I'm going to give you 30 seconds, and here's what I want you to think about. What skills and abilities will someone need to do this job well? Have a think, and then I'll hear what your thoughts are. So your 30 seconds of thinking time begin now. Okay, your 30 seconds are up. So let me hear what you think. So can you come a little bit closer to the screen? What skills and abilities will someone need to do this job well? Tell me your answers. hmm hmm Yeah. Nope, very good. Lots of good answers there. So there's lots of things you might need to think about. This person, well, they're probably going to have to be quite polite. They're going to have to be maybe quite confident and someone that's well spoken as they go and talk to the Queen. There's lots of things for us to think about. So thank you for sharing your ideas. We now have a bit of a job description complete. But let's think a little bit more. As you know, the Queen is a very important person, and so we can't have just anybody going to talk to her. We need to make sure that we get the right person for this task. We need to send someone who's really good to go and meet with the Queen, and we need to make sure that they haven't really done anything bad in the past. Then there's the rules that they'll need to follow when they're actually with the Queen. I wonder, do you know some of the important rules when it comes to meeting the Queen? Let me tell you, you have to curtsy or bow. Let's practice our bow. Three, two, one. Very good. I don't know how to curtsy, so I'm not going to show you how to do that. But you have to do that. You always have to use the right greetings. On being presented to the Queen, the correct address is Your Majesty. And then once you've called her Your Majesty, you have to continue to call her Ma'am. You have to be early. Guests should always arrive before the Queen. And finally, you have to see what the Queen does and follow her lead. You don't talk unless the Queen talks to you. You don't sit down until the Queen sits down. You don't begin to eat until the Queen begins to eat. There is so much to think about if we want to make sure that we get the right person for this job. But let me ask you another question. Do you think we could give the job to someone who is a shepherd? Yeah, maybe you're not sure. What about this? Do you think we could give the job to someone who's a murderer? No, I don't think that would be someone we could give the job to at all. And that's why, well, our next Bible character and our next hero of faith for tonight is such a surprise. So let me tell you about Moses. Moses grew up in Egypt after his parents had saved him from being killed by the Pharaoh. You see, God's people lived in Egypt, but Pharaoh was beginning to get worried about how many of them lived there. And so he decided he was going to treat them really badly. He made God's people into slaves and he worked them really hard. Even worse than that, though, he said that any baby boys who were born, well, they had to be killed and only the girls were allowed to live. So when Moses was born, well, his parents got him to safety, and he ended up being taken in by the daughter of Pharaoh, who raised him as her own son. Now, this is really important because it means that Moses understood the Egyptian lifestyle, but he also discovered when he was older that the people being treated as slaves were actually his people. He came from them, he was one of them. And so, well, he begins to feel bad for them as he sees how badly they're being treated by the Egyptians. So much so that one day, when he sees an Israelite, one of his people, being treated badly, he jumps in to defend them and he ends up killing an Egyptian. When Pharaoh found out what happened, well, he wanted Moses dead. So Moses ran away into the wilderness, and years later, we find him looking after his father in law's sheep in the wilderness. Before we continue to think about this story, let me ask you another question. What ways do we communicate with other people? What ways do we talk to each other? Well, we can talk to someone face to face. We can call them on the phone. We can do video calls. We can send them messages and emails. We could even write them a letter and post it if we wanted to. And then there's other ways that people communicate as well. Ways like sign language or maybe even Morse code. There are lots of ways that we can talk to each other. But none of us have ever spoken to each other the way that God spoke to Moses in today's passage. So let me read it for you and let's see what happened. We're going to read Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 12. And here's what it says. One day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he went deep into the wilderness near Sinai, the mountain of God. Suddenly the angel of the Lord appeared to him as a blazing fire in a bush. Moses was amazed because the bush was engulfed in flames, but it didn't burn up. Amazing, Moses said to himself. Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go over to see this. When the Lord saw that he had caught Moses' attention, God called to him from the bush, Moses, Moses. Here I am, Moses replied. Do not come any closer. God told him, take off your sandals, for you're standing on holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. When Moses heard this, he hid his face in his hands because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord told him, you can be sure I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries for deliverance from their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I'm aware of their suffering. So I've come to rescue them from the Egyptians and to lead them out of Egypt into their own good and spacious land. It's a land flowing with milk and honey, the land where the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites live. The cries of the people of Israel have reached me, and I have seen how the Egyptians have oppressed them with heavy tasks. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You will lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Well, but who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Moses asked God. How can you expect me to lead the Israelites out of Egypt? And then God told him, I will be with you. And this will serve as proof that I have sent you. When you have brought the Israelites out of Egypt, you will return here to worship God at this very mountain. Isn't that amazing? God spoke to Moses through a burning bush, and he told him three things that are really important for us to remember. The first thing we see is that God cares about us. God told Moses that he'd seen and heard just how terrible a time his people were having. Sometimes people can think that God doesn't actually care about them. They maybe think that God isn't there or that he's just ignoring them. But this story, the story of Moses, proves God isn't far away, but God is actually close and he knows what's going on in our lives. The good news is that he doesn't just know about the tough times we face, but we can see that he wants to help us in those moments. God cares. The second thing we see is that God wants to use us. See, God doesn't like that his people are being treated badly, so he decides he's going to set his people free. But the amazing thing is that he's going to use Moses to make it happen. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. How can God use Moses? He messed up big time. Moses has killed someone and Pharaoh wants him dead. There's no way that Moses can do this job. And Moses probably thought the same thing. He probably thought, God, why would you want anything to do with me? I've messed up too much to be able to be used by you. I can't do this. I wonder, do you ever feel the same? Do you ever think to yourself, God wouldn't want anything to do with me? I'm too bad. There's too much sin in my life for God to love me. Well, the good news is that God can forgive and he can save and use anyone as long as they put their trust in him. When Moses said, "Who am I to do this job?" God replied with a great promise. God said, "You can do this job because I will be with you." And the third thing we see is that God is always with us. You see, God doesn't look for the really beautiful, the really talented, the really popular people so that he can use them. No, you don't have to be amazing to be used by God. God uses ordinary people. God uses people that don't even think that they're good enough. Why? Well, because it's not about us. It's all about God. God gives us what we need to live for him and to serve him. So all we have to do is trust him and trust what he says. I want you to remember that the next time that you feel like God couldn't love you, or the next time you're going through a difficult time and you feel like God doesn't care, or when you're worried about a big task and you just don't think you can do it, trust in the promise that God makes. He's always with us. He loves us. He will save us and he will use us if we simply put our trust in him and we say, Jesus, I want you to be my king.